Throughout history, names have carried power. In ancient belief systems, to name something was to claim authority over it, or risk invoking its presence. But what if some names were never meant to be spoken at all? What if they weren't just words, but spiritual triggers, keys that unlocked forgotten forces best left buried? There are stories, buried in banned texts, whispered in demonology, and scratched onto the backs of forbidden grimoires, that speak of 7 fallen angels. Not Lucifer. Not just vague demons. These were specific entities. Named. Feared. Bound. Their names once echoed in the halls of heaven, before rebellion turned them into exiles. And when they fell, they didn't just vanish, they taught humanity forbidden knowledge, war, seduction, witchcraft, corruption. Ancient texts say these names were so spiritually radioactive that early priests, scribes, and mystics refused to speak them aloud. To name them was to open a door you couldn't easily shut. Today, we dare to ask the question: who were the 7? Why were their names erased from canon? And what still lingers behind each forbidden syllable? You've heard of fallen angels. But these were the ones even heaven tried to forget. To uncover the names of the 7 forbidden fallen angels, we have to turn not to the Bible, but to a text the early church and rabbinic Judaism deliberately left out, the Book of Enoch. Once widely read among ancient Jews and even quoted in the New Testament, Jude 1 verses 14 to 15, this mysterious work was eventually cast aside, considered too strange, too mystical, too dangerous for inclusion in the canon. Why? Because it reveals what Genesis only hints at. In Genesis 6 we read that the sons of God took human wives and their union produced giants, Nephilim. But the Book of Enoch fills in the blanks, naming these sons of God as watchers, angels appointed to observe humanity. Instead, they rebelled, descended to earth, and unleashed chaos. Not only did they corrupt human bloodlines, they taught forbidden knowledge, weapon making, astrology, enchantments, seduction, even abortion. The Book of Enoch does more than tell the story. It names names. Among the hundreds of fallen angels, Enoch identifies 7 leaders, the generals of the rebellion. These were not low-ranking demons. These were archangels turned traitors, now bound in judgment, their influence still whispered in occult circles today. And so, Enoch became a banned book, locked out of the Bible and most traditions. But its revelations never disappeared. Because the moment these names were written down, they became permanent, and the darkness behind them began to echo again. Long before demons were cast as red-skinned monsters in folklore, there were the Watchers, angels created not to destroy, but to observe. Appointed by God to watch over humanity, they were meant to be silent witnesses to creation's unfolding. But the Book of Enoch reveals that something went terribly wrong. Instead of watching from afar, a group of 200 watchers, led by powerful angelic chiefs, descended to earth, not by accident, but by oath. They gazed upon human women and lusted after them, swearing among themselves to take wives, to bear children, and to share with mankind the hidden knowledge of heaven. It was the first angelic rebellion, and it didn't happen in heaven, it happened right here on earth. Their union with human women produced the Nephilim, giants of violence and corruption who devoured all they touched. But the damage wasn't just physical. The Watchers brought with them forbidden knowledge, secrets that humanity was never meant to wield. They taught sorcery, enchantments, the signs of the stars, weapon making, and the arts of seduction. Knowledge that looked like power, but led only to destruction. These Watchers were more than disobedient. They were cosmic criminals, crossing divine boundaries that should never be crossed. And their leaders, the 7, were considered the worst of all. Their names were recorded in Enoch not to honor them, but to warn us, these weren't just fallen angels. They were the origin of corruption itself. Among the 200 Watchers who descended, 7 stood out, not just as participants, but as ringleaders. These were the ones who organized the rebellion, led the others into oath-bound defiance, and brought the most dangerous knowledge to humanity. The Book of Enoch doesn't just mention them, it names them, one by one. Let's unveil them now. Semjaza, the chief of the Watchers. He was the one who convinced the others to go through with the descent, swearing them into an unbreakable pact. Without him, the rebellion may never have begun. Azazel, perhaps the most infamous. He taught mankind how to make weapons, swords, knives, shields, and also taught women the art of adornment, sparking pride, vanity, and war. According to Enoch, the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. Armaros, he taught the binding of enchantments and the secrets of casting spells, effectively opening the door to sorcery and occult practice on earth. Barakel introduced humans to astrology and divination, manipulating the heavens to gain false insight and power. Kokabeel, literally, Star of God. He taught the constellations and corrupted the celestial order by turning divine signs into tools for manipulation. Penemu, he taught writing and secret knowledge, which sounds innocent, until you realize that in Enoch, this knowledge was twisted into deceit, false doctrine, and hidden blasphemy. Castaja, perhaps the darkest of all, he taught humans about abortions, wounds to the embryo in the womb, and how to destroy life before it even began. These were not myths to the ancients. These were the names of danger, spoken in fear, etched into memory, but avoided in ritual. To speak them aloud was believed to court their presence. That's why most traditions locked them away, banning the Book of Enoch, and burying the names alongside it. These 7 weren't just fallen, they were architects of corruption, responsible for a spiritual infection that still haunts the world. In the ancient world, a name wasn't just a label, it was a spiritual key. To speak someone's name was to summon their essence, to give them access. That's why the names of the 7 fallen angels weren't just removed from public liturgy, they were deliberately suppressed. These weren't simply bad angels. They were seen as the original corruptors of mankind, beings whose very names carried influence. According to early Jewish mystics and church fathers, saying these names aloud was to risk invoking their presence, opening spiritual doors that should never be opened. Some rabbis even warned that the utterance of a watcher's name could invite spiritual attack, nightmares, or seduction into false knowledge. Their identities were passed down only in secret, hidden in apocryphal texts and occult manuscripts, far from the eyes of the uninitiated. That's why you won't find their names in the Bible, not because they weren't known, but because they were considered too dangerous to preserve in sacred scripture. Even in magical grimoires like the Book of Raziel or the Lesser Key of Solomon, the names appear only with extreme caution, often surrounded by divine seals and warnings not to misuse them. Early Christian thinkers, too, feared what might happen if these names were normalized, worried they would glorify rebellion or inspire mystical obsession. In essence, these names weren't just forgotten by history. They were forbidden, buried in the shadows to protect the faithful. Because in ancient belief, what you name, you give power to. And some names were never meant to be heard again. Despite the warnings, the names of the 7 fallen angels never truly disappeared, they simply went underground. Hidden in grimoires, whispered in ritual circles, and scrawled in the margins of forbidden texts, these names began to resurface, not in temples, but in occult traditions that sought to harness their power. In books like the Ars Goetia, the Book of Shadows, and the Red Dragon, names like Azazel and Semjaza are summoned in rituals meant to call down knowledge, wealth, seduction, or destruction. Practitioners believe these beings, though fallen, could still grant favors to those who dared to speak their names properly, often with ceremonial circles, candles, sigils, and blood oaths. Even the Kabbalistic tradition, while rooted in divine mysticism, acknowledged the power of naming and warned against invoking fallen spirits without the strict protection of sacred names like YHVH or Michael. The Zohar, a cornerstone of Jewish mysticism, hints at such beings still lurking on the spiritual fringes, especially in the dark Sephirot known as Qliphoth, the shadow side of the tree of life. Fast forward to today, and these names still echo on internet forums, occult TikTok, and pop culture. But often, they're stripped of context, used casually, even carelessly. What ancient mystics once feared is now treated like fantasy. But make no mistake, the traditions that feared these names for centuries didn't do so out of ignorance. They did it out of experience. Because once a name is spoken, it's out there. And you don't always get to control who's listening. The fall of the Watchers wasn't just a footnote in ancient mythology. It was a cosmic fracture that reshaped the spiritual landscape of the world. These 7 forbidden names represent more than individual beings. They symbolize the moment when divine gifts were corrupted, when wisdom meant to glorify God was weaponized to enslave man. Each of the fallen angels taught humanity something powerful: astrology, weaponry, sorcery, seduction. But these weren't mere skills. They were sacred mysteries, never meant to be handled by human hands. What began as curiosity became obsession. What was meant to illuminate began to consume. According to the Book of Enoch, the result was catastrophic. The Nephilim, giants born of angels and women, filled the earth with bloodshed. The world was so corrupted that God sent the flood, not just to cleanse humanity, but to bury the fallout of angelic rebellion. The 7 leaders were bound in chains, cast into the depths, awaiting judgment. But their legacy endured. The knowledge they gave could not be unlearned. It scattered into cultures, languages, rituals. And in the shadows of history it grew. Whether through Babylonian magicians, Egyptian priests, or medieval sorcerers, the echo of the Watchers' rebellion never truly faded. These 7 names weren't just part of the past, they represent a cycle: when the divine is twisted, when knowledge is stolen, and when power is pursued without reverence. Their legacy is the reminder that rebellion against heaven doesn't just fall, it echoes. Generation after generation. Whisper after whisper. Name after name. In recent years, the once forbidden names of the 7 fallen angels have resurfaced, not in sacred texts or ancient rituals, but in the most modern of spaces, the internet. YouTube channels casually rank them. TikTok creators use their names as hashtags in aesthetic edits or dark divine manifestations. Forums post rituals to connect with Azazel or Semjaza as if they were deities to be followed, not warnings to be feared. What was once treated with holy caution is now content, turned into memes, merchandise, or mystical life hacks. The names appear in games, graphic novels, and occult-themed TV shows, often stripped of their original spiritual gravity and recast as tragic anti-heroes or misunderstood cosmic rebels. But this trend comes with danger. The casual invocation of ancient, spiritually charged names, especially ones linked with rebellion, corruption, and destructive knowledge, has always been viewed as risky by mystics, priests, and prophets alike. Not because of superstition, but because of the ancient understanding that naming is summoning. Even unknowingly, even playfully. When ancient scribes and early church leaders warned against these names, they weren't being controlling, they were being protective. Because names are more than syllables. They are doorways. And some doors don't just open. They invite. Names are more than letters. In the ancient world, they were seen as essence, identity, and access. To know a being's true name was to have a thread of connection, a potential invitation into your world. That's why the names of the 7 fallen angels weren't just erased from Scripture, they were sealed. Semjaza, Azazel, Armaros, Barakel, Kokabeel, Penemu, Custadia. These weren't names passed down to honor or remember. They were names buried, out of reverence for the damage they caused and fear of what they could still awaken. They stand as a warning, of divine gifts corrupted, of knowledge misused, of rebellion wrapped in beauty and wisdom. They are the echoes of a war that began not on earth, but in the heavens. And the cost of speaking them carelessly? In ancient belief, that cost was spiritual access, influence, oppression. So the question becomes, what if those ancient scribes were right? What if these weren't just old stories or mythic archetypes, but real beings, sealed away by divine order, and every time we speak their names, we chip at that seal? Some names were never meant to be remembered. These 7? They were never meant to be spoken.